Oh, for more on the legacy he leaves behind, we're now joined on the line by former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Aziz Pahad. Aziz, welcome to the Globe this evening. Well, probably somebody that you personally had to interact with during your term as Deputy Minister.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, fortunately for me, it was the time when we had just got our democracy, and it was probably one of the most volatile and uncertain environments in international relations, and which affected the UN especially. So tonight, I think we must celebrate the life of Kofi Annan, because he was a Pan-Africanist and internationalist, and indeed was committed to peace and security, but took over at the most difficult time in world politics.
But perhaps one of the things that one would want to understand is, during his term, this was the time at which the OAU and eventually the African Union adopted the Zulu New Consensus and the certain declarations which were really making it clear of Africa's intentions and wishes in as far as the UN and perhaps the Security Council are concerned. How did he relate with such declarations which, I mean, on the other hand, he's head of the UN, but he's also an African?
But the difficulty is, in fact, when we assess his term, we must understand that the UN was a system created after the Second World War.
Yes.
And since 1994, we've been trying to mobilize support for the transformation of the multilateral institutions, including the UN Security Council. And Kofi Annan was not a magician. He had to work with the global realities that the UN, especially when he came in as a UN Secretary General, we were living in a world that was a unipolar world dominated by the United States. And there were the P5 countries who were indeed the winners of the Second World War, who had the veto powers. So in an environment where nobody was, especially the NATO powers, were not adhering to international law, rule of humanitarian law, the Charter of the United Nations, it would have been very difficult for Kofi to try to fundamentally change the situation. But he did a lot in his term to try to do exactly that, including the Zulu Consensus.
What would you say are some of the milestone achievements which go down with his name?
Well, I think as a Pan-Africanist and multilateralist, he did try to improve the image of the United Nations. It was the time of the Iraqi war. At least we must give him credit that South Africa had always opposed the intervention in Iraq on the basis of very falsified information. And at least we could interact with him. But he tried to ensure that there was a negotiated solution in Iraq. But in the end, the balance of forces were not in his favor. And what the milestone he did leave was to lay the basis for a United Nations that would understand that without peace in Africa, and indeed in the Middle East and elsewhere, you can't have a world that would survive. And he put the African agenda quite squarely on the UN agenda. And indeed, in his term, we were able to lay the basis for a partnership with the AU Peace and Security Council and the United Nations Security Council dealing with African issues. Now, that was a good step, but I won't pretend that we've had a lot of difficulty with some of the major powers in the UN, especially in the Security Council, to begin to properly accept this understanding that what Kofi was trying to do was get the regional parties more involved in areas and in issues that were affecting world peace and regional peace and security.
One of the highlights, of course, becomes the responsibility to protect the vulnerables, which the United Nations obviously adopted. As he passes on, one cannot help but would like to reflect at such policies or guiding principles, if you may call them. What are your views regarding that?
Yeah, I think the issue of human security was connected. Basically, our own view was that, and the AU in the Algiers Declaration took that position that we must intervene in the internal affairs of even African countries. If there was a threat of genocide, a threat of crimes against humanity. And Kofi's understanding of human security was linked to his understanding of development, is totally linked to peace, stability, and security.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there has been a tendency in recent years, after Kofi had left the UN, for human security also to be exploited by some major powers to bring about regime change. Now, this is still a challenge that we must, as we, all smaller countries, need multilateral system that is fundamentally transformed to ensure that even the concept of human security is applied in a way that does not allow us to get the major powers to use it as a smokescreen for regime change.
Well, I'm not so sure if you would be able to know, but I would really like to know, how would somebody like Kofi Annan feel about the Sudan question when, he had been so much involved in ensuring that there's peace in the broader Sudan, but Southern Sudan has never known peace effectively for so many years.
And that's one of the issues. If Kofi would be looking down at the world today, he'd say, as he warned, that we need to work together to deal with the African challenges. As you know, most of the issues on the agenda of the UN Security Council are African agendas.
Yes.
And Sudan, both South, especially the South, is one of those issues that will be, again, in the UN Security Council agenda. And there is a certain change in the balance of forces now, with the emerging powers, etc., where one can hope that our struggle to transform the UN Security Council can at last achieve some successes. There's been an opposition to transforming the UN Security Council. The veto powers are an anachronism, as I said. But Kofi would be worried that after so many years, the South Sudan situation is getting worse in many ways than it was during his time. And we had a lot of discussions with Kofi about the African conflicts, including South Sudan and other African countries, the DRC, beyond Africa, Iraq, Iran. And he would be very concerned how some major powers are dealing with the same issues, that if we had followed what Africa and indeed what Kofi, now the new General Secretary, is trying to do, we would have avoided the death of millions of people.
Mm-hmm. Aziz Pahad, thank you very much for joining us this evening. That was Aziz Pahad, the former Deputy Foreign Minister right here in the Republic of South Africa.